the amendments mostly relate to procedural issues with the Election Act and returning officers and what they're empowered to do and what to do in case of primary mode of communication or results failing. And they're mostly in line with what politicians have been recommending and mostly in line with the recommendations that have come up the grapevine from political representatives and polling agents of political parties. So most of them went through, most of them were actually, other than one amendment of Section 230, all of them were unanimously agreed and approved and had been built up in the committee to near unanimous understanding. So that's not controversial at all. The only amendment, and the most obviously significant one, is the attempt by affecting an amendment to Section 230 of the Elections Act in a way that it takes away the temporary nature of caretaker governments and tries to give it more of a role than perhaps is envisioned in the Constitution or can be allowed by the Constitution, beyond a stopgap setup put in place only to guarantee a fair and free election and just to hold fort until then, towards perhaps a setup that is allowed to take consequential decisions for the country, even though they have no democratic input into their existence. So that the first attempt, which surfaced on the 25th of July, was a very all-encompassing amendment to Section 230, which allowed decisions to be taken by the government if it could be argued that they were urgent. And those decisions could be taken if they were represented wherever circumstances existed to render it expedient for caretaker governments to take such actions with regards to multilateral institutions or agreements. So it was really a blank check to a caretaker government to argue expedience and importance and economic necessity and do whatever they wanted, and perhaps take certain decisions that elected governments are shy away from taking or don't want to take the blame for. But regardless, it was an attempt to give an unconstitutional role to the caretaker governments. We see then what surfaced yesterday is a far tighter and stricter language of the law, at least, which allows the caretaker governments only to act upon already existing privatization and public-private partnership and commercial transaction issues, and to deal with already existing multilateral and bilateral treaty arrangements. However, this in itself is also not completely free of problems, because the privatization commission has before it numerous issues of privatization, and unless something is in its final stages, I don't see how a caretaker government can assume the democratic legitimacy that is required in the process of privatizing something, for example, an airport or an airline. And I don't see how a caretaker government can think itself legitimate to do so. So even in this final product, as diluted and restricted as it is going beyond the scope of what a caretaker is as envisaged in the Constitution. Well, the consequences are that if you have a completely unelected and a completely undemocratic setup, even if it can be said that this coalition perhaps doesn't command the support of the majority of the people, its mandate is stale, you can still say that there's a fair few amount of people that first voted for it. So it's a stale mandate, it's a weak mandate, but at least there's a mandate. As far as the caretakers are concerned, there's no mandate. They are absolutely ungrounded in any concept of democracy or democratic norms. So for them to step up and start taking decisions for the country, like the Punjab caretakers have been doing for the past year, extraordinarily against Supreme Court decisions, and the Pakhtunkhwa caretakers have been doing over the past year, again extraordinarily, and again against the Constitution and against express decisions of the Supreme Court, if this becomes a norm in the Federation, then, well, you're basically saying that democracy is optional, really. And you're also saying that the powers that be have more faith in these hand-picked types that don't really have to answer to the people. So what it means is a further erosion of the political and democratic process to the detriment of political and democratic powers, and obviously to the detriment of the people and their right to representation. In my opinion, caretaker setups are redundant and shouldn't exist in the first place. And an election can be held under the incumbent government as long as real day-to-day executive power is given away through the Election Commission as envisaged in the Constitution to bureaucratic elements that are not of their choosing. And I think that is enough to ensure a free and fair electoral process, as long as the government of the day isn't influencing the police of the area, isn't influencing the commissioners of the area, isn't influencing the magistrates of the area, which is very easy to prevent. I don't think this caretaker setup is at all necessary. I think it is a It is a problematic endeavor. It is a over-the-top interim solution. It takes away from the respect and trust that is bestowed in politicians all around the world. It weakens political systems. It stops political traditions from coming into place. It stops a smooth transfer between political parties. It stops conversations between political parties that would have otherwise become necessary if this interim setup wasn't an outsider. This outside interim setup wasn't a part of the plan. If smooth transition of power between political parties and their governments was envisaged, we would have today had a stronger political tradition of conversation and continuity. I think all of this is affected by caretaker and the understanding of caretaker regimes. And also, I think it allows for fiddling with the political process from outside forces, which we see repeatedly every 5 years. We hear of this, the really intelligent caretakers are coming and they're coming for a couple of years. The constitution be damned. And frankly, it's something that should be put a stop to.